El Chapo is locked up for life at the supermax prison in Colorado, and in a letter from behind bars, the billionaire drug lord seems irked about the lack of freedom being afforded to him.
In a shocking audio recording from a closed-door meeting at ADX Florence supermax prison, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was heard desperately pleading with federal prosecutors and Judge Brian Cogan through tears, begging them not to reopen his case for capital punishment. His voice breaking, El Chapo offered to cooperate with any investigation, give up billions more in hidden cartel money, and even testify against his own sons to avoid the death chamber. The recording went viral instantly, confirming that the notoriously ruthless cartel boss is now facing his darkest fear as Washington pushes to restore federal executions for major drug traffickers. So here's the thing that's got everyone freaking out right now. El Chapo's already serving life plus 30 years at ADX Florence in Colorado, which is basically as bad as it gets in the American prison system. But recently, there's been this whole conversation happening in legal circles about whether the government could actually go back and try to give him the death penalty, even though that wasn't part of his original deal. When El Chapo got extradited from Mexico back in 2017, there was supposedly this promise that the US wouldn't seek the death penalty. That was part of the whole extradition agreement with Mexico, because Mexico doesn't have capital punishment, and they won't hand people over if there's a chance they'll get executed. But now some legal experts are saying the government could potentially break that promise, especially with how things have changed politically in the past few years. The whole breach of extradition guarantees argument basically says that even though there was this agreement with Mexico, the US government could technically decide to go back on it. It's wild to think about. But apparently there's legal precedent for breaking international agreements when national security or major criminal cases are involved. Nobody really knows if they'd actually do it, but the fact that it's even being discussed is making people nervous. Then there's this whole fentanyl situation that's making everything more complicated. The government has been cracking down hard on fentanyl trafficking lately, and the Sinaloa cartel that El Chapo used to run is one of the biggest suppliers of that stuff. There's this idea floating around that they could use what people are calling the fentanyl doctrine to justify elevating his case to capital punishment. Basically, they'd argue that because the cartel is responsible for so many fentanyl deaths, it should be treated as a mass murder case that deserves the death penalty. What's really got people talking is this 2025 policy shift, where the federal government announced they want to restore the death penalty at a federal level. For a while, federal executions were kind of on pause, but now there's this push to bring them back for certain cases, and everyone's wondering if that means they reopen big cases like El Chapo's to make an example out of them. It would send a message that nobody's untouchable, not even someone who's already locked up for life. The scary part for El Chapo is that all these pieces could line up at once. You've got the fentanyl crisis, the push to restore federal executions, and questions about whether extradition guarantees even matter anymore. Put all that together, and suddenly a case that seemed totally closed could potentially be reopened. It's like the worst-case scenario for someone who thought they'd avoided the death chamber. Let's rewind to July 17, 2019, when El Chapo stood in that Brooklyn courtroom for his sentencing. This was after a 3-month trial where basically everyone who'd ever worked with him testified against him. The jury had already found him guilty on all 10 counts, which included running a continuing criminal enterprise, drug trafficking, murder, conspiracy, and a bunch of other charges. Life in prison was mandatory for the main charge alone, but here's where things got really interesting. Instead of just taking his sentence quietly like most people do, El Chapo actually spoke up. For like 10 minutes, he stood there in his gray suit and told Judge Cogan that there was no justice in his trial. He wasn't talking about being innocent or anything like that. He was specifically calling out the jury, saying they'd messed up and didn't follow the rules. The whole thing came from this report that one of the jurors had talked to Vice News after the trial and admitted that some jurors have been checking news articles about the case, which they absolutely weren't supposed to do. El Chapo and his lawyers were claiming that the jury had been exposed to all this outside information that wasn't allowed in court. Stuff about him allegedly abusing young girls and other wild accusations that never made it into the actual trial evidence. His voice was literally shaking as he talked about his treatment in New York while waiting for trial and sentencing. He said it had been torture, calling it the most inhumane situation he'd ever experienced in his entire life. Coming from a guy who spent decades in the drug trade and did some seriously brutal stuff himself, that's saying something. He talked about physical, emotional, and mental torture, basically describing his time in solitary confinement as worse than anything he'd been through. The whole courtroom vibe was super tense. His wife Emma Coronel was there watching, and at one point El Chapo blew her kiss and tapped his heart twice. She blew one back. Everyone knew this was probably the last time they'd see each other, since she wasn't allowed to visit or even write to him in the supermax prison where he was headed. It was like this really human moment in the middle of this massive criminal case. But Judge Cogan wasn't having any of it. He went ahead and sentenced El Chapo to life in prison plus 30 years, just like the prosecution asked for. He also ordered him to forfeit billions of dollars, specifically $12.60 billion, which prosecutors said was a conservative estimate of how much drug money he'd made over the years. The judge basically said that given everything El Chapo had done, life in prison was the only appropriate sentence. El Chapo's lawyer Jeffrey Lichtman called the whole thing a show trial and said they had the best chance for appeal based on the jury misconduct issues. But at that moment, standing there in that Brooklyn courthouse, El Chapo had to know his freedom was pretty much gone forever. His 2 legendary prison escapes in Mexico meant nothing now that he was in American custody. Fast forward to 2023, and El Chapo's situation got even worse. By this point, he'd been locked up at ADX Florence for 4 years, and he was really starting to feel it. In a series of letters that got leaked to Mexican media, he basically sent out an SOS saying the conditions were pushing him toward insanity. These weren't just complaints about bad food or whatever. He was talking about serious psychological torture. In the letters, El Chapo described how he was getting woken up multiple times every night by blasts of extreme hot air that would last about 15 minutes. He said it happened 4 or 5 times a night, made his heart race, and didn't let him sleep properly. The heat was supposedly increasing his blood pressure too. But the wildest part was that he claimed prison staff were actively trying to kill or poison him, which sounds paranoid, but he seemed genuinely convinced. He talked about having no access to group therapy and nobody to help him deal with the trauma of solitary confinement. According to his letters, the prison staff at ADX Florence just ignored all his requests to see a mental health professional. He mentioned experiencing depression and memory loss, which he said were symptoms of severe sleep deprivation. For a guy who used to run one of the world's biggest drug empires, being completely isolated and helpless was probably the worst punishment imaginable. Then, in 2024, he wrote to Judge Cogan again, asking if his wife Emma Coronel and his twin daughters could actually visit him. Emma had been released from federal prison herself by that point. She'd done 3 years for helping run his drug operation and money laundering. El Chapo pointed out that prosecutors had blocked her from visiting him in New York because they thought she might pass threatening messages to witnesses, but he said that was ridiculous since all prison visits are recorded anyway. His daughters were in school in Mexico and could only visit during vacation periods, maybe 2 or 3 times a year at most. His mother and sisters didn't have travel visas, so Emma would be his only visitor. He was basically begging for any human contact beyond his illegal team. The prolonged isolation was clearly getting to him in a major way. In another letter, and was attempted to press Emma's money and press back to an attack. First, Cobb. He called it unprecedented discrimination and said the prison kept using his past escapes as an excuse to treat him worse than other inmates. He wrote that officials were scared he was planning another prison break, but he thought that was a ridiculous claim used to justify treating him inhumanely. The thing is, ADX Florence is literally designed so nobody can escape. It's called the Alcatraz of the Rockies for a reason. Since it opened in 1994, not a single person has ever escaped from there. The cells are soundproof, tiny, and the inmates can only see the sky through their windows, so they don't even know where in the building they are. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day in their cells, getting just 1 hour to exercise or make phone calls, and they're handcuffed and shackled even during that hour. El Chapo wrote one particularly sad letter where he mentioned it had been more than a month since he'd been able to get a stamp to send mail. He had to wait for money to get deposited in his commissary account just so he could buy a stamp and submit his letter. For someone who used to have billions of dollars and could buy anything, not being able to afford a stamp was probably humiliating. The sentencing hearing in July 2019 was the culmination of a case that had been building for literally decades. After a 3-month trial in Brooklyn, the jury had convicted El Chapo on all 10 counts in the superseding indictment. The charges included narcotics trafficking, using firearms to support his drug crimes, and participating in a 10 Halloween badge, money laundering conspiracy. But the big one was operating a continuing criminal enterprise, the Sinaloa cartel, which alone carried a mandatory life sentence. Judge Brian Cogan, who'd overseen the whole trial, handed down the sentence that everyone expected: life in prison plus 30 years, to run consecutively. On top of that, Cogan ordered El Chapo to forfeit $12.60 billion, which was supposed to represent the money he'd made from decades of drug trafficking. Prosecutors said that was actually a conservative estimate of his total profits. The prosecutors were pretty clear about why they thought life in prison was appropriate. They talked about how the road that brought El Chapo to that American courtroom was lined with drugs, death, and destruction. Multiple witnesses during the trial had testified that he ordered and sometimes personally participated in the torture and murder of people he thought were his enemies. The level of violence he'd been responsible for over 25 years was just insane. Assistant Attorney General Brian Benchkovsky said at a press conference after sentencing that for more than 25 years, El Chapo thought he was untouchable. He thought there was no problem the Sinaloa cartel faced that he couldn't solve by bribing, intimidating, torturing, or killing his way out of it. But standing in that Brooklyn courtroom, all that power meant nothing. American justice had finally caught up with him. The life sentence was mandatory because of the continuing criminal rights. Enterprise conviction, which included 26 separate drug-related violations and 1 murder conspiracy. The jury had found him guilty of 25 out of 27 predicate offenses that formed the basis of that main charge. Between the narcotics trafficking, the weapons charges, and the money laundering, there was just no way around a life sentence. What made the sentencing even more final was the additional 30 years tacked on for the firearms violation. It was basically the government's way of saying they wanted to make absolutely sure he never saw freedom again. Even if somehow the life sentence got overturned on appeal, he'd still be looking at 3 decades behind bars. 2 days after the sentencing, on July 19, 2019, El Chapo was transported to ADX Florence by helicopter. That's where he's been ever since, expected to spend the rest of his life in one of America's most secure prisons. For someone who'd escaped from Mexican prisons twice before, including once through a mile-long tunnel on a motorcycle, being locked in a supermax prison must have been a harsh wake-up call about his new reality. After the sentencing, El Chapo's defense team immediately started working on appeals. His lawyer Jeffrey Lichtman had been saying throughout the trial that it was unfair and that the jury had violated Judge Cogan's orders. The main argument for appeal was based on that Vice News article where an anonymous juror admitted that some jurors had been following media coverage of the trial, which they'd been explicitly told not to do. The defense filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that the jury misconduct had tainted the whole verdict. They pointed out that jurors had apparently been exposed to information about El Chapo that wasn't allowed in court, including allegations about him drugging and sexually abusing underage women. That stuff never made it into the trial because the judge ruled it wasn't relevant to the drug trafficking charges. But Judge Cogan denied the motion for a new trial. He said he'd already addressed the jury exposure issues during the trial itself. There were 2 separate times when he'd pulled jurors aside individually to ask them about articles they'd seen. After talking to them, he determined they could still be impartial. He also said that even if you assumed everything in the Vice News article was true, it wouldn't have changed the outcome because the evidence of El Chapo's guilt was just overwhelming. So then the case went to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal appeals court that covers New York. The defense filed 10 different legal challenges, basically trying every argument they could think of to get the conviction overturned or at least get a new trial ordered. They alleged violations of El Chapo's rights and pointed out what they said were major procedural failures in how the trial was conducted. In January 2022, the appeals court issued its decision, and it was bad news for El Chapo. The Second Circuit rejected all 10 of his legal challenges, and completely affirmed the conviction. The three-judge panel basically said that Judge Cogan had run the trial properly, and that there was no reason to grant a new trial or overturn the verdict. The appeals court specifically addressed the jury misconduct claims. They said Judge Cogan was right to trust his own observations of the jurors over the uncorroborated statements from one anonymous juror talking to a magazine. The court noted that Cogan had been keenly aware of all the media coverage during the trial and had given the jury repeated instructions to avoid it. He'd also questioned jurors individually when specific articles came up, and he determined they could still be fair. The Second Circuit also pointed out that any potential prejudice from jurors seeing outside information would have been harmless, given how much evidence there was against El Chapo. They weren't saying jury misconduct is okay or anything like that. They were just saying that with 56 prosecution witnesses, including multiple cartel members who testified about El Chapo's role in running the organization, there was no realistic chance that a few news articles would have changed the jury's minds. All of Judge Cogan's previous decisions got validated by the appeals court. His rulings on what evidence could be admitted, how he handled the anonymous jury for security reasons, the restrictions he placed on the defense, everything got upheld. It was a complete loss for El Chapo's legal team. The appeals court's decision basically said that the 3-month trial had been conducted with diligence and fairness, and that Cogan had issued meticulously crafted pre-trial rulings. In other words, they thought the trial judge had done everything right. The resulting judgment was affirmed, meaning El Chapo's conviction and sentence would stand. After the Second Circuit ruled against him, El Chapo's options became really limited. He could try to appeal to the Supreme Court, but the chances of them taking the case were basically zero. The Supreme Court only hears a tiny fraction of the appeals that come to them, and they tend to focus on cases that involve major constitutional questions or conflicts between different courts. El Chapo's case didn't really fit that profile. To understand why El Chapo's case became such a huge deal, you gotta know who he actually was before he ended up in American custody. Joaquín Guzmán Loera was the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, which was basically one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world. For decades, he ran this massive criminal empire that moved tons of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and other drugs into the United States and other countries. El Chapo, which means shorty in Spanish, became famous not just for being a drug lord, but for his repeated prison escapes in Mexico. The first one happened in 2001, when he supposedly bribed guards and escaped from the Puente Grande federal prison by hiding in a laundry cart. He stayed on the run for 13 years before getting caught again in 2014. But then in 2015, he pulled off what might be the most legendary prison escape ever. While locked up at the FAG Altiplano Maximum Security Prison in Mexico, his people dug a mile-long tunnel that went right to the shower in his cell. He literally rode out on a motorcycle through this underground tunnel and disappeared again. The FAG dug. Whole thing was captured on security cameras, and the footage of him just walking over to his shower and climbing down into the tunnel became world famous. Mexican authorities finally recaptured him in January 2016 after a dramatic raid that involved a shootout. By that point, there were multiple indictments against him in the United States from different cities, including, quote, Mita, Chicago, San Diego, New York, Miami, and Texas. All these different jurisdictions wanted him for various drug trafficking charges going back decades. In January 2017, Mexico finally agreed to extradite him to the United States to face charges in Brooklyn, New York. This was huge because Mexico had been really reluctant to hand him over, partly because they were embarrassed about him escaping twice from their prisons. But there was also this whole negotiation about the death penalty. Mexico doesn't have capital punishment, and they have a policy against extraditing people to countries where they might be executed. So, as part of the extradition agreement, U.S. prosecutors had to guarantee they wouldn't seek the death penalty against El Chapo. That promise is what makes all the current talk about potentially bringing capital charges against him so controversial. When El Chapo arrived in New York, he was immediately placed under the strictest security measures. They kept him in solitary confinement at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan while he waited for trial. He was only allowed limited contact with his lawyers, and very restricted phone calls with family members. The government re-grabbed his car in the centers of the country while watching this family with some conscious presence. It lasted 3 months and featured testimony from cartel members who'd turned on El Chapo to cooperate with prosecutors. They talked about the structure of the Sinaloa cartel, how they smuggled drugs across the border, how they laundered money, and the violence they used to control territory and eliminate rivals. It was basically a peek inside one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. El Chapo had pleaded not guilty to all the charges, and his defense argued that he wasn't actually the leader of the Sinaloa cartel like the prosecution claimed. But with all the witnesses testifying against him and the evidence the government presented, including messages, financial records, and testimony about murders he'd ordered, the jury didn't buy it. They found him guilty on every single count. Now, he's one of the most high-profile inmates at ADX Florence, locked up alongside terrorists, serial killers, and other major criminals. His story went from being this almost mythical figure who could escape from any prison to being permanently trapped in America's most secure facility with no hope of ever getting out. But here's what makes the current situation so crazy. After escaping twice from Mexican prisons, surviving decades at the top of the drug trade, and thinking he'd at least avoided execution by getting life in prison instead of the death penalty, El Chapo might now be facing the possibility that the government could come back and try to give him a death sentence after all. That would be the ultimate twist in a story that's already stranger than any movie. The federal government is seriously considering reopening this closed case to execute someone who's already serving life without parole. They're actively discussing breaking the extradition agreement with Mexico. The fentanyl crisis is being used as justification to apply the death penalty retroactively. And El Chapo did break down and beg for his life, exactly the way that audio recording captured. The audio is real, and it reveals everything about how his situation has changed. The men who once tunneled out of a maximum security prison on a motorcycle, who ran a billion-dollar drug empire, who was untouchable for decades, that guy is now just another inmate counting down the years in a concrete cell, facing the worst outcome imaginable. He's finally scared. And that recording of him begging Judge Cogan not to give him the death sentence proves that even the most ruthless cartel boss in history has a breaking point. The question isn't whether El Chapo is terrified of execution. It's whether his desperate pleas will actually change anything, or if Washington will make him the first example in their new war on fentanyl traffickers. Or if Washington will make him the first example in their new war on fentanyl traffickers.